Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. It's spring, baby! When we're recording, I don't care. When this episode comes out, it's pretty much spring.
You don't care.
I'm claiming it. It's in my bones. I don't care
Even
if it's
fake spring.
It's fake spring.
Fall spring.
Fall
We have
spring,
a lot of fall springs.
fall spring.
A lot of winters.
Is this
Blackberry
one of
winter,
those
redbud winter
times when, like, you call it like a redbud winter or a dogwood?
This early, I think it's just winter. I don't
Just
know
winter.
that there's any kind of winter.
Early March is just winter.
I think we just actually had legit winter this year.
Yeah.
Versus, normally we haven't had.
We had dirty snow winter, meaning it hung around long enough to get dirty. So it's been there for a while.
Cold.
Yeah.
Cold.
Yeah. Very cold.
Yeah,
plants still seem to be happy. They're like,
right, yeah.
This is winter. Everybody relax. I saw my daffodils starting to poke up.
Nice.
Ones close to my house that have, gotten some good warm soil from the brick.
I told Alexis this the other day how my son and I were walking around our yard and we saw the daffodils coming up, and he tried to explain to his dad that there are flowers that are coming up and they're the flowers that still need to be in bed. He's like, they need to go back to sleep. They're coming up too early. So the sleepy flowers, and my husband was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It's daffodils.
Because he wants to plant sunflowers and you told him it's still time to sleep.
Killing him. Yeah. He can't plant his sunflowers yet.
Not time. It's not time.
They're not snowflowers.
It's not snowdrops.
Nope.
Not that. So
well,
it is that time of year.
Talking about
that time of year, right? To talk about gardening and how exciting
that was the shortest
it is.
and most linear intro we have ever done.
Straight
I'm a one,
lives.
okay? That's who I am as a person.
Oh my.
Your personality, your whole personality is just getting.
Alexis is making reference to the Enneagram. Some listeners will have heard us talk about that, but if you know your number, be sure to drop it in the comments or let us know. We don't know what Ray or Jessica might be. Jessica just went through a different type of personality test called DISC.
Yeah.
And I'm going to reuse the joke from the break. So your type was DVD-ROM.
Yes, that is correct.
Compact. Yes.
I'll
be more like, what's the pre-disc?
You're a floppy disk?
Yeah. Even the VCR tape, Betamax. Yes, thank you, Brett. Yeah. I'm like the OG, the Betamax that's 14 inches wide, and you put in the big pine. Yeah, I'll be the Betamax. I'm not an alpha for sure. I'm a Betamax. That's right. I'm happy.
Well, this isn't the Joe Rogan podcast. This is the Hort Culture podcast. So there's plenty of room for betas.
Exactly right.
Anytime. Betamaxes.
Alexis had something we need to follow up on sometime, and I meant to tell you, Alexis, during just conversation before the show, you mentioned, well, what your garden looked like based on your personality type, and I actually did a little program on that years ago, based on a certain assessment tool, and
that's cool, right?
That is cool.
Who's the English gardener and who's the Roman straight line gardener with the trim, control. Yeah. So, and it was very interesting. And, we need to do something with that sometime, based on
upcoming episode. Based on your personality.
All use it on this podcast. We need to all take the same assessment or go through the same process, find out our personalities, and see if there's anything.
That's fun. That's a very fun idea.
I would love to do that, Alexis. That was a great idea. When you said that, I was like, oh, this needs to happen. Really, we need to take a little time as a group. There's 4 of us here that are on the show weekly, and we need to do that. And then we need to compare notes based on what our actual landscapes and gardens and all the associated plantings look like. So,
I like
you, Alexis.
Yeah.
Well, maybe to that end, or as a prelude to that, I thought we'd do a little role playing here on the podcast, if that's okay with you all. So this is inspired by a conversation with my next door neighbor. Shout out to Eric. He has been doing some gardening off and on for the last few years, but he was texting me about essentially, I think, the timelines of gardening and sometimes always feeling like you're ahead or behind. And here we are. You're hearing this episode at the very earliest. You're hearing it on March 2nd. You may be listening to it after that. And thinking to yourself, in Kentucky's zone 6B, 6A, depending on where you are, am I way behind the curve or am I way ahead of the curve on getting a garden started this year. Like it's by the time 4th of July rolls around, it's kind of a lot has gone past. But here in March, what is the proper timeline? And so I thought maybe you all might have dealt with a few folks in that realm, and just to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about. And this is when I transition into. I'm not going to do a voice or anything. That would,
Please,
Aw.
Brett.
I
Please do a
mean,
voice.
no, I don't. I
Well,
won't even submit my enemies to that. I'm thinking about growing snow peas, beets, cucumbers, tomatoes, and lettuce.
there's a
Wide
lot
range there.
yeah, there's a wide range. I mean, cool and warm season stuff that you just mentioned.
Mhm.
But as a new gardener, and this is a common scenario that we get in extension, both specialist and field staff. And so this is the point where we start asking back a lot of questions. I don't know, Joe Gardner or whatever your name may
Please
be,
call me Brett.
Brett Gardner, uh, Brett, your exact scenario, but
My dad is
uh,
Mr. Gardner. Please call
Mr.
me Brett.
Gardner, that's right, Mr. And you're just Brett Hohandle Gardner.
Isn't there
Yes,
someone
full name.
in the ag economics department with the last name Gardner?
I think
Oh,
so. Yeah. I'm
Yeah?
sure that there must be because it's not an uncommon last name. But this
There's
is
a
scenario.
NFL quarterback called Gardner Minshew. So
Oh, I did not know that.
Solid.
I did not
Well,
expect that
Mr.
factoid.
Gardner.
Good. I like it.
yeah, Mr.
But
Minshew.
this
Yeah.
is the point where we start asking questions back because it has to do with first thing I think of when people are talking about getting started. I want to know their experiences, what they've done before. And if they're fairly new to it, we begin to ask questions like, do you plan on growing transplants? Which may or may not be a good idea, depending on your knowledge, skill level, and your facilities and equipment. And start from there, usually, because if you're going to involve yourself in any kind of transplants, obviously you have to back that up 6-8 weeks for a lot of different transplant productions. But
Well, so okay, so
no,
the ones that
you're not too late.
I'm talking here about snow peas, beets, cucumbers, tomatoes, and lettuce. Just again, are
Mhm.
there some of those that you would recommend growing from transplants or not growing from transplants?
Your peas,
yeah.
anything that has a really large seed, typically you can just plop right in the ground. So like if it's big enough for like a small toddler to handle, and I say that because their dexterity and that's why they have the big crayons is not as good. So if it's something that they can like pick up one of, corn, beans, peas, then usually direct seeding is the best way to go, especially with your peas. They don't love to be transplanted. They get
Like cucurbits, aren't they? Yeah. Some crops
Mhm.
just don't like to be messed with. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
And
After
then
drain.
also your cool crops, the ones Ray mentioned, you've got cool and warm weather crops. So your peas, your beets, and your lettuce could all be considered your cool weather crops, and which means that they tolerate a cooler soil and they like a cooler atmosphere. And so at the beginning of March is a great time to direct sow all of those.
Right now is the beginning of March.
Yeah.
Oh my
Right.
goodness.
So you're telling me
So
that this is good news that I came to you now.
this is good news. And if
You
you have garden space, that could be even a pot. It doesn't necessarily even have to be, tilled ground or something. All of the things you're talking about could, in theory, be grown in a nice sized pot. Um,
Yeah.
and
That's
you
the
could plant them right in a pot. That's ready.
yeah.
So
yeah,
the
that's
so
the
the
the following question that Alexis just brought up is usually like, okay, well, if you're gonna do your own transplants or if you're gonna direct seed, what are you gonna direct seed in? Do you have, garden space that you can like till up in your ground? Do you have flower pots? Are you doing raised beds? Are you gonna build your own raised beds? Have you thought about, there's a
It's more
few
about the
we
mechanics, isn't
work
it, Jessica?
backwards kind
Yeah.
of, right?
It's
Mhm.
Yeah.
like where are you at? I mean, there's one thing to break soil on sod, which tends to be cooler just from its very nature of being covered with sod. So you start asking all those questions of native soil, which is pretty common. Or is someone leaning towards a large planting container or raised bed garden? Two are completely different
Yep.
scenarios. Yeah.
Well, I'm
I
glad you asked me
honestly
that because I have two scenarios that I'm thinking about.
Okay.
One, because I'm a true leaf, in addition to being a good little boy, I got my soil test last fall to
Oh, nice.
see what things would, and based on the recommendation I got from my extension agent, I made some amendments and I've got planned to add some fertilizer. So I have some in-ground beds that are prepped. They're kind of
Beautiful.
ready
Oh,
to be planted
Good.
at some point. But I also was thinking it would be nice to have some raised beds for some of this stuff, and maybe just as a different look. Is it too late to create a raised bed and then plant into it this same spring or summer?
No, not at all.
No.
A lot of those crops, I mean, I don't know that you mentioned them, but if you're talking about snap beans, a lot of those aren't planted here in central Kentucky until the, frost free dates, which in the spring is what, the very last of April, beginning of May.
Derby
That's a
Day.
very important
Mhm.
date. Yeah. Very important date, wherever you're at. You're here in central Kentucky, Brett. So you would base a lot of the decisions you make on that frost free date, which, a lot of the crops, that means that you're planting after the fact. So yeah,
So
that'll not too late.
I got the pea. You said the peas. Help me again. The peas, the beets. What was the other cool season one?
Lettuce.
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 So you're telling
Mhm.
me when I go to put this garden out, I'm not going to be planting all of these at the exact same time.
No, not unless you're doing succession planning, and we won't muddy the water with that.
So
So
I
yeah,
can put out those three things: the peas, the beets, and
Right.
the lettuce
your cool
earlier than I
seasons.
can
Yeah,
the other stuff.
yeah,
Mhm.
But
and
if you decide you want to attempt to grow your own tomatoes, right, from seed because you often get a more wide variety to select from, right, versus what you're gonna find at local greenhouses, farmers markets, and, box stores. Um, so even though you can plant some of that stuff outside now, you can also start those tomatoes inside
Warm
now
season.
as well, because 'cause they're gonna want that warmth. You might wanna get a heat mat to go with them, same thing, if you wanted to do peppers. Some of the solanaceous crops, they just take a little extra time to get going. So, not only can you do stuff outside, you can also start some other things inside if you wanna go down that road of attempting to grow some of those summer crops as well yourself.
at this point, it's usually the point where I will mention to people when they start to get an overwhelmed look in their eye because of garden
Did I look
mats
that
and all of.
afraid?
I see the fear, Brad. And now, if you are depending on the platform you're watching this on or listening to this on, if you're on YouTube, you'll see the fear in Brett's eyes. The overwhelmed expression lets me know that I should suggest to him to look into ID-128, and that's our Kentucky Gardening Manual. And all of this information we're giving you today is contained in handy charts within that manual around pages 12 and 13. You will find, if you're producing transplants, you will find very, very important dates on common garden crops, of not when to plant those crops, but if you're dealing with transplants, is when to seed those.
Mhm.
To have those transplants ready for 6 to 8 weeks later at the proper time. You'll have that chart, and you'll have early and late safe planting date charts for. We break Kentucky down into three regions: Western, Central, and Eastern. And you will have the earliest safe dates to plant things in the ground on average, and you'll have the latest, which is a very important date to me. The late dates. I mean, I'm starting to use that more and more. But the latest safe dates to put things like snap beans in the ground. So we are throwing a lot of information at you, Brett. But all of
Yeah.
this information is in that manual.
So
It's in
I'm
handy charts.
digesting this.
Okay.
I managed to look it up while you were
Stay with
talking,
us
and
this long, yeah.
so I went to my favorite web browser and I typed in ID 128, and the thing that came up was this really cool publication with, let me see what's on the front, some peppers in some pots to emphasize that point you made earlier, Alexis, about how you can grow stuff in pots. That's cool. I hadn't even really thought about pots, but I'm thinking maybe I might look into
It
that.
even has a chart in it, or at least it did. I'm sure it still does, of how many plants
Yeah,
you can put in what size pot. So for
which
Mhm.
example,
is
it'll tell you you can put one tomato in the equivalent of like a 5-gallon bucket, but you could
Mhm.
put 2 or 3 bean plants in a 5-gallon bucket. So that can be really helpful if you're like, well, I can only fit 3 5-gallon buckets on my porch. So what am I going to get the most bang for my buck for?
One of my
Cool.
favorite charts that I don't talk a lot about on there. It's a kind of a hybrid chart, but it appeals to the type A in my brain. I think if you're looking at the latest manual, it'll be on 20-1, Brett. But if you look at that, it'll list crops starting at the earliest crops that can either, and the chart designates whether you start them indoors or they're direct
Mhm.
seeded outdoors. I love that chart because I give this to home gardeners all the time, but I like that it's kind of in chronological order, starting with all the way back in January with things like onions. What you can start indoors, onions, January 15th if you're in Central Kentucky, January 22nd. Love that chart because it goes by month, what you can do in general. It's a great chart. And not only that, but on the lower right-hand side, it's got, those important frost-free dates for different zones in Kentucky. So
Yeah, so I found, maybe we can talk about that one in a minute. I found
yeah,
down there on page, I think 22 of the one that I'm looking at least, had the earliest and latest dates, but I'm looking on page 20-13. There's table 20.6. I wasn't expecting this many numbers. I thought this was more of a plant situation, but 20.6. And it's talking about transplant production data or information, and it's cool. I hadn't even thought of it this way, but so I'm looking for under warm season here, because I know that I've got cool season and warm season stuff. Under the warm season, the cucumbers that I want to start, it's recommending that my transplant be 3 to 4 weeks old.
Mhm.
And it even says here, so okay, if you want that, and so remind me again, cucumbers, that's one of them that I want to wait until after the frost that it goes out as a plant.
warmer.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
more like a May 1st kind of plant. Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. And so it's saying for like a 3 to 4 week transplant to go out sometime in May, that I probably need to start that around April 1st at the earliest.
Which, garden math, right?
So
4
yeah, that makes
weeks, you start at
sense.
April 1, you
Mhm.
go to brings you up to May 1. So that's a cool thing about these charts. They were developed for Kentucky using historical data. It's all very local, specifically to Kentucky and the three main regions we have. So yeah, it works really good.
So, and something else I didn't actually realize was that like different plants, depending on, so cucumbers and melons and stuff, compared to tomatoes, compared to peppers, you actually want your transplant to be at a different age.
Yeah,
What's
some
that?
some just
Why is
some
that?
just some just grow faster. I mean, a tomato, like if you find yourself looking at this website that Mr. Brett is on, you'll see that a pepper is more like a 6 to 8 week. If there's a big difference between a pepper and a cucumber. Cucumbers get to a plantable stage about twice as quick. They're 3 to 4 weeks instead of so that's why this chart is so good. And even experienced home gardeners that don't produce a lot of transplants, I've showed them this table and it's an eye opener for them. They're like, wow, we've never seen it, put in such a straightforward form, all this information. So it's one of the charts it's one of the first charts that I go over with home gardeners as we're looking at garden math and making sure we plant things at the right date. So, or,
I would
seed.
say, and you've heard me say it before, but I'm going to reiterate. So if it gives you say it says 6 to 8 weeks until transplant, go go with the lower number. So plan it if you want to do peppers. Peppers are 6 to 8 weeks. Go with 6 weeks out from your goal date. So if your date is May 1st, count back 6 weeks, because I'd rather you plant it and maybe it's more of like a 7 or 8 week. I'd rather you plant it a little bit later. So maybe
Okay.
it's March 8th. Than planting it too early, or that plant getting really stressed because it's 8 weeks
Yep.
out and oh no, a late frost has come, or oh no, it's been raining for 2 weeks and I can't get outside. It's better to have a healthy transplant that's a little bit younger and putting out later than an unhealthy one that's root bound going out, quote
So,
unquote.
so you're saying that I should view these average seedling dates as the earliest date possible, and if I go a little bit later than that to start them, that's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
90% of the time, it's better to be a little bit later and have a really strong transplant that's not been stressed going out into the
It's gonna
ground.
take off better once it gets out there. You're
Mhm.
gonna get production out of it sooner than you are that stressed one, as Alexis has mentioned.
Mhm.
Cool. So I'm not sure. Do I have to start my transplants myself?
No.
No, no, no.
I
You can
suggest if
definitely
you've
get
never
plugs.
done it before, yeah, go
I'm
get
just nervous
plugs,
about, yeah.
buy them from the local high school, buy them
Mhm.
from, support local growers,
A lot of the
get them
farmers
that way.
markets do them
Oh,
now,
cool.
and whether it could be cut flowers, it could be vegetables, anything like that. You can get them, and that's a great way to support farmers early in the season
Mhm.
too, because they're money is tight, and a lot of the times they don't have stuff, to sell, of produce to sell. So
Yep.
grabbing what will be some tasty tomato plants, and then you can always supplement later if you need more. So
Yeah. Oh, that's a great.
benefit.
Yeah, because
Another
it can be
tip.
kind of daunting, right?
Yeah,
Starting
it's
your
scary.
It's a
own
little
seeds,
scary.
right?
Yeah.
Making sure you have enough, because we could go in a whole topic of that, making sure you have the right amount of light, water, all of that, depending on
Yeah, I feel
what
better
you're
about the
doing.
plants being outside and getting some rain and other things, when they're inside and I have to,
Baby them.
yeah, you give them too much water or too little. So yeah, I mean, I think I would like to start my own transplant someday, but I don't think I'm quite ready. So I think my plan is going to be, so I guess that means if I'm going to do that, I could just go to the farm. I'm going to buy them from the farmer's market, for instance. Other people sell the plants. I can just go and get those on closer to my planting date that I'm going to
Right.
put plants in the ground.
Yeah,
And
then
as
you
I
only have to worry about the planting date rather than the transplant and planting date. So
Cool.
yeah,
Well, I
simplify.
might try a few lettuce seeds as transplants and just see if I can get them started, because I ordered a bunch by accident and I have enough. And then I'm going to buy tomato plants, I think.
Yeah, lettuce you usually don't have to do as a transplant. You certainly
Oh, okay.
can if you're doing like a head lettuce, but lettuce is one of those things you can direct seed, which takes the stress off of you, but also the plant tends to be a little bit happier. And so that means you can just, whatever ground you have ready, whether that's, like I said, a pot, a raised bed in, native soil, just making a little furrow and sprinkling them in there. I've seen people do, which can be fun, especially if you've got kids that you can work with, what we call seed tape. If you've not heard of seed tape before, I think they have stuff about seed tape in ID 128, but you can look it up. Basically, when I've done it, Jessica, I don't know how you've done it, but we've used like double ply toilet paper because it breaks down, in water. And so you separate those plies and you stick a little seed in the proper spacing. So say you're doing head lettuce and it should be, 8 inches apart. I'm just making those numbers up right now. Those are all the ID
Right.
128. But let's say it's 8 inches apart. You put that toilet paper down, and every 8 inches you stick a seed. And then all you got to do is you bury that entire strip. And so,
And she mentioned we're gluing them on, and you're gluing them often with, so like when I do it with kids, I do this as a project every year with our ag day. And we use flour and water mixed together to make a paste, right? Because it's going to dissolve. And they just use toothpicks, and they put a little bit of like the glue. They learn to measure. They have their measuring sticks and their rulers, and they mark off how many inches between the seeds. Put a little bit of glue on there, which is the flour and water paste, and then that same toothpick, they can pick up one of those tiny seeds very easily and stick it right on that glue, and then it dries and it's ready to go and plant.
I've noticed that it's become more popular over time. I mean, commercially, you could always get the coated seeds to make them easier they're modified with some kind of clay coating or something like that to make seeds bigger or more easier to run through a mechanized system. But now for homeowners, I'm starting to see that more, because a real problem with the small seeded stuff is that they simply drop down through the cracks in soil. They go too deep, they never germinate, or they don't get enough. They don't get the requirements that they need to grow
or you lose
properly.
them when the wind
Yeah.
blows, you breathe on your hand too heavy.
Yes,
That's why I
and there
bring up
goes
the seed tape.
$5
You
worth of
don't,
seed, yeah.
it doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
have to be something you can do with the kid. If you're just like a person who likes a project, especially if it's like still cold or it's really rainy outside, and you can do this for yourself, and then you can just wrap that back up onto something and it's ready to go, in another week when you are able to go out and plant. So
And so the seed tape, the toilet paper, that's going into the ground?
right. So you're burying
Okay.
it completely, because that toilet paper dissolves in a day as soon as it
And
really
just
gets warm.
follow, as we say constantly, whatever the seed packet says, that's
Mhm.
what you follow, your spacing and your depth of, planting.
Yeah. So I do have a couple of questions about that here in a second, but I wanted to just take a look at some of these dates on table 2015. Also, thank you all so much for your time. I know that it's not typical to have 3 extension people helping someone who's never grown a garden before, but I really appreciate
If
it.
we're going to talk about dates, can I give you my tip for calendar? So
Yeah,
please. Okay. So
obviously, I'm here to
growing
learn.
growing when you get to, commercial growers, a lot of time you'll see growing the weeks of the year, and so they'll say, sow this on week 20, plant on, week 40 or whatever. So it's just how many weeks are in a year. But
Wait,
what I have
Week
found
20. Week 20 is like January
20
1 is the first
year.
week, and then
Mhm.
January 7. Okay, got it.
So, but on your phone calendar or your, whatever digital calendar you use, but even your paper calendars, you can switch to have those turned on, and they can be really helpful if you're looking at a seed packet that maybe is telling you, sow this on a certain week. But what I like to use it for is, if we're saying, plant 8 weeks before your frost date. Well, you can go in and say, my frost date is May 5th. That's week 20. And then I can count 8 back from that. And so then you're just subtracting 8 from 20. And sometimes, like, how the Mondays don't always line up, and, you're trying to count back
My
Mondays.
Mondays never line up.
Your Mondays
No,
never
with
line
anything.
up, or whatever it is.
Mondays.
It seems really silly, and you're like, Alexis, I can just count it on the calendar, but the number of times I've still gotten it wrong when I'm just trying to count, 8 Tuesdays
Yeah.
back versus if I can just subtract and find an actual week. I have
No,
found
makes
that really
total
helpful.
sense.
So
I think the idea of that, yeah. So you're saying instead of working off of actual dates that change each year,
right.
instead you're working off of which sequential date, week of the year it is. We've done that with some of the price reporting stuff. We report the 42nd week of the year, or maybe
Yeah.
not that much, but 32nd week of the year for farmers market prices or something like that. It's similar kind of deal. That makes sense. So as I'm looking at these, and Ray, you mentioned I'm in the central, and I went and double checked. There's a little map where I could see that I am confirmed in the central region. It looks like, for the most part, I am ahead of the curve on everything. Everything on here, the earliest safe planting date is after when I am right now. The only one that's close, and technically I guess I'm behind, is my snow peas. They say March 1st, and today's March 2nd. I'm probably not going to get them in until the end of the week. Does that mean
Better a little
that
later
I miss
than too
that I
early.
miss the window, or can I?
I think you're right in the window, because a lot of these, remember, are the earliest dates.
Oh,
The
okay.
very earliest dates you should be thinking about it. Yeah.
Also, I think of them as a week. So if it's, sow on week 20, you have a full 7 days of a week, right? So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm
It
not
seems
sure
like,
that
as a
I.
home gardener, Brett, you're probably well ahead of the curve of a lot of especially newer gardeners. You're way ahead of someone that calls me on May the 1st and says, "What can we do?" So we start from a lot of times
a
that.
fall garden.
Yes.
Thank you for
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Plan
Thank you
for
for
your
that
fall
praise.
garden.
Or, I mean, then we start talking about that latest safe dating, the latest date chart for
Yeah, you
Central
can
Kentucky.
get a call in the same week. One is I want to have a tomato garden, and our tomatoes going to be at the farmers market this week. That both happens on May 1st.
Right.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, that is not that. That's pretty common, in fact. So,
Sorry, I
yeah,
broke character.
yeah,
Um,
did
Beans, corn,
you
and
broke her?
tomatoes. That's what
Yeah.
everyone's looking for.
yeah, I guess any other thoughts you all have as far as the timing goes? And I noticed all of these late dates. Does that mean, like, is that when I would be picking it, or like what's that about?
It denotes it on the chart there if it's direct seeded, first of all, or transplant. For those latest safe planting dates, from my experience working with home gardeners, we don't use that side of the chart as much because spring gardens are more typical.
Hmm.
The frustrating thing for me about the latest dates, from a homeowner perspective, is that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff. If you go to this garden manual and you look on that 20-22 page, or whatever version of the file you're looking at, is that keep in mind that transplants, for those things that should be transplanted, you may not have the availability that you think you might have for gardens that are planted out of that typical spring season.
To buy them from someone
So
else, you
you may
mean?
not have a source for those. You may not be able to buy
Right.
those. So yeah, that's a tough thing. Yeah.
The store has transplants for the spring because everybody's excited, but
Yes.
in the fall I may need to start my own.
Cole
Yes.
crops is a
Exactly.
good example of
Hmm.
that because
What is that?
Yeah.
What's a coal?
so you're like your broccoli, your
Oh,
cabbage, all of those kind of crops, cauliflower,
greens, the green stuff.
right?
Yeah.
And
To,
they traditionally do really well in Kentucky in the fall.
mhm.
Hmm.
Um, and It just depends, because sometimes you can find it at local stores in the spring, right? But then a lot of times we heat up too quickly for them in the spring, and they enjoy those cooler nights.
Mhm.
So it's kind of lucky when you can find like a local feed store or garden supply store that will actually carry those transplants or greenhouse in the fall, in the time, because
Yeah.
a lot of times you don't see them so much at farmers markets, because by that time those farmers market vendors are rocking and rolling with their tomatoes that are coming in, and if they do have any of those transplants, they're planting them for themselves,
Yeah.
Right.
to have that produce available coming up.
It's much more common for commercial producers to involve themselves with that. I very rarely find a good selection of all the things that I want for those late safe
Yeah.
planting dates, the fall crops.
Hmm.
You're absolutely right when you deal with those. So if you get interested in those as a home gardener, you either work out a deal directly with a small local greenhouse or plan on growing those yourself if you want access to the varieties that you want, if you have specific things in
Well, that
mind.
makes sense, and I'm glad that I checked and looked at it now, because I think so. I mentioned I'm not really going to grow any transplants this spring myself. I think I'm going to let the pros do that one more time at least. But I'm kind of surprised how early some of these latest safe dates are. Some of them are in June, even
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
in
So I don't know if
July.
we answered your question though, Brett, on like why that late date is.
Yeah, why
So
that is? Why
why
is that?
shouldn't you plant after that latest planting date? So um the whether it's warm season or cool season, we've talked about how there's crops that don't like the cold, and then there's crops who thrive in the cold, right? And so
Mhm.
the idea is that they have a certain number of days until they reach maturity, and maturity is them,
Mhm.
fruiting or being harvestable. And so if you plant them too late, they won't reach maturity before that untimely weather comes in, or that
Central Kentucky's like
bad
last of
weather comes
October,
in.
beginning of
I
Right.
November.
see. So you need to
The
just give them that, saying you have to have this in by July 15th allows that thing to get to its mature stage before
Before
it gets too cold
frost
for it.
kills it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Correct. Right. Right.
And the days
Exactly.
are getting
Ah.
shorter. So, I mean, you take something like a tomato and it's amazing. You plant that
That's very
thing
true.
late and they're just so day length sensitive that the crops just don't do well. Number one, the
Mhm.
frost is going to get them. Number two, the days are too short to produce those warm season crops. So, double whammy. Good point, Alexis. Yeah.
Cool. Well, so I do have a few uh seeds picked out for some stuff that I'm maybe wanting to grow, and maybe I could read through. So this, I'm looking at some beets here, for instance, and they say, and I'll go ahead, since we're video conferencing for you all helping me out here. I'll go ahead and share the link to these beets that I'm looking at, and they look yummy. I love a roasted beet.
Mm-hmm.
Hope to grow
Try
one
them
someday.
every year, and still it's a no.
Not a fan, huh?
Tastes
Yeah.
You mean
tastes a little
eating
bit like
them?
dirt for you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Mm.
Do you like pickled beets though?
I
I like pickled
can't
beets.
think if I've had pickled beets or not.
Yeah.
There are
So
definitely some beets that I think if they get too hot, maybe that they do taste more like dirt.
Wonky.
And I really like beets, but like sometimes I'm like,
Yeah.
They taste like
this
dirt. Yeah.
It's
tastes like
like
dirt.
one of those things I try every time. I'm like, this is the year. I'm going to like it. And then
I'm
I'm
proud
like,
of
Yeah.
you.
oh,
how
no.
many times have
Oh,
you done it?
I don't know. A lot.
Like more than 10?
Multiple
Probably.
times.
Same
Oh,
thing
Yeah.
with lemons.
There's some kind of break even number, like with kids trying stuff, where it's like if you try it this many
it
times, then
becomes
it's
a
like
no-go.
probably not.
Yeah, just go away from it. Yeah.
I just need to stop at this point.
Just give it up, okay? Just beat
Maybe.
it.
And
Maybe.
don't try beet juice as an alternative. That will
Oh
make things
no,
better.
Ooh, yeah, that doesn't seem like a good
that
It
also
alternative.
is.
sounds like a nightmare trip to the bathroom later when you forgot that you
Yeah.
drank beat juice.
Mm.
Yeah, that's
Like,
yeah, so many bad
Well,
things.
it was just a sip, and I was like, this
Not
is
for
not
you.
good. It was
Beats
in,
Battlestar Galactica,
honor
yeah.
of, yeah, it was in honor of Dwight Schrute,
Yes, I was gonna
deceased.
say Shroot
oh,
Farms.
because every time I
Yeah.
have beats, I always almost call a nephrologist, be like, I think
What
I'm
is
done.
yeah. I
happening?
have to remind
Yeah,
myself. Don't forget
Turns
you
out,
ate beets.
done for.
If it's a beet asparagus a day, all bets are off.
ooh,
Yeah,
it's a multi-sensorial experience, like
yeah,
synesthesia.
it's gonna be a bad day for everybody.
So on here it says that the days to maturity on these beets is 55 days. So you're telling me, as I went back to the ID 128 and I look here, and it says my earliest safe planting date is March 15th. So if I were to go out and put a beet in the ground March 15th and it germinates, 55 days from then, in theory,
Yep.
things can change a little bit.
Almost
I'm
2
going to have a
months. Yeah.
beet.
Yep.
You should be able to harvest. Yeah.
Yeah.
So by like the middle of May ish, right?
Impressive, isn't it? If you do radishes, it's like some of them are like 30 days. It's wild.
And this is an important thing to point out on seed packs, and there will be some variance based on specific varieties. That's why I love the seed packs, and almost all seed packs that I've ever seen will say how many days to maturity. And you'll notice I'll pick on tomatoes again. There's a big variance in
Yeah, I noticed that.
tomatoes, or beets don't vary as much. But look on that seed pack, and on average, this chart is going to get you where you need to be, give or take, plus or minus a few percentage points. But on things like tomatoes, it can be more significant. Things like
Right.
sweet corn, it can be way,
Yeah,
a
there's
big
some
variance.
sweet corn varieties that can be very long to maturity, but then
Yeah.
there are those out there that you can find that are a quick maturing one that are good for planting in like late
Mhm.
June. So you get
Yeah.
like a fall crop of sweet corn because you can be harvesting sweet corn in September. With them.
These averages are good, but just keep in mind that if you're like, oh, I planted my tomato at this time and it was 2 weeks later than what the chart said, well, that probably is a varietal difference.
Yeah, well, as I was
That
shopping,
and
I noticed that like there's tomatoes on here that their date of maturity is 60 days, and there's other ones where it's over 100 days.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
That's over a month difference.
Yeah, really
Yeah.
incredible.
And you got to think of environmental things too.
Mm.
Like, with that can play a part in it with
Cool
maturity.
springs.
Cool
Yeah.
springs, or if it gets too hot too quick, because eventually, I don't know, we probably have already said this on here at some point, just not this episode, but like eventually it gets so hot outside that even the plants are like, I'm done. I'm not producing.
They go sterile, the blooms do,
right?
bad things
So-
happen with vine
so-
crops, a lot of the crops, yeah.
So things can happen like that too. That can fluctuate that day to maturity, but it's pretty accurate most of the time.
Yeah. Gardening more than anything is about the math. It's about the calendar. Yeah, getting that right.
In the world of bonsai, they talk about a period of summer dormancy where there's like the biological processes slow down so much just because it's so hot that so that makes sense to me. So I guess the main other thing I was thinking about, I guess, is just making sure about the spacing, and like I don't want to have way too many or put them in too close. Would you recommend looking somewhere in a publication, or is this a seed
in
pack
that gardening
question?
publication? Seed pack, yes, but also that gardening publication that we've been referring to constantly during the course of this episode. Yeah.
So this is saying begin sowing. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and then like when you buy transplants, most of them will have like sometimes you might buy them from somebody and it'll just have like the name on them, but majority of the time they will have tags that will have that information as well, like your spacing and what their needs are.
So what's the downside of planting this stuff too close together?
If it's
Number
a root
one,
crop, they won't get as big.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, obviously, if you have a container, it's a little different. If you have a big container that gets,
to water a lot more.
Yeah, water more. It's self-shading, diseases.
I was going to say disease. Leaves can't dry off as easily.
Yeah.
For that disease pressure. I automatically think of tomatoes. When they get planted too close together. It's hard to harvest them unless you're going to, prune and tie them and all of that.
Okay, well, I'll make sure to space them out. So I'm looking at the beet seed directions here, just making sure that I understand these before I go home and forget everything.
Drop the beets.
Before I go home and drop the beet. Begin early sowings when soil has warmed, but I'm gonna go based on the seed, the date that was in ID 128, and even maybe go a couple days past that. 15 seeds per foot, a half-inch deep. Rows 12 to 18 inches apart. Thin to one plant per 3 inches. For a continuous supply of greens and small tender beets, sow seeds at 2-week intervals until 8 weeks. That's more advanced than me. I want to get one round of beets. So thin to one. Does that just mean like how do I do that?
So beets are one of the weird ones. You picked a weirdo.
Way to go, Brett. Way to go.
One beet seed, what you would grab as one beet seed, is actually got multiple embryos in it. So
Mm.
one in theory, like one quote unquote beet seed will produce multiple plants. So it's sort of like it has, quadruplets basically. That would be the
Oh.
equivalent of that. Versus something like lettuce is one seed is one plant. All right. So that's you picked a weirdo. So that's one of the reasons it tells you to thin is because it knows that you are going to get way more plants than you actually need, but there's no way you can avoid it because of
Mm.
the nature of that seed.
I see.
And it's hard thinning, or the concept is thinning is
Mhm.
hard for people sometimes because a lot of them, when you're direct seeding, you're just taking that package, or you're sprinkling them along that furrow, or you've put it's hard to space like those little beet
Mhm.
seeds all apart,
Mhm.
or like a carrot seeds, and then they all come up together, and you're like all excited about all your little plants coming up, and then you're gonna go back through and you're gonna rip them out, right? You just need to
Yeah.
get that proper spacing, and that's hard sometimes for people to do that. But then, as we've already mentioned, Alexis already said, the overcrowding, they are just not going to produce as well
Quality
if you
over
leave them.
quantity.
Yeah, if you don't do that thinning.
So to ask a
So,
silly question, thinning just means pulling them out,
yep,
Yep.
pulling out
Yep.
ones that are too close together.
Some people will
Right.
yep.
do pinching. I mean, there's different ways to accomplish that. It could be a specialized little hand rake
Yeah,
or
little
hand tool.
scissors or
Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of different ways to do that.
So I'm putting out more than I'm going to need, and then I'm taking out some to leave room so that the ones that are left behind can grow big and
Your
strong.
Mhm.
And
garden
putting
will
out a
thank you
little bit
later.
extra is always good because you may
Yeah.
have, some get eaten by a bird or a mouse
Yeah.
or just not germinate because they got too much water or whatever that is. So, you're kind of compensating, and seed is so inexpensive in comparison to like a transplant.
Yeah.
So is there anything you would recommend that I do in the ground versus in my raised bed that I'm going to build?
Uh, Things like I think of crops and the way that they grow. Like corn is to me
Corn,
not a
yeah.
good use of a raised bed
Yeah.
because the size of corn and the intensity. I save crops like that for in ground. Because and there's a big difference. There's a huge difference between the nutrient profile of in ground, which is more buffered, native mineral based soils. Dirt. Sorry, Alexis. I know that I just twitched, but that's more buffered, so you can typically deal with nutrients a little easier in soil. And I think about all those crops and raised beds, and you have to be a little bit more careful about your fertilizer usage.
I also think about like space wise in that raised bed. We talk a lot about square foot gardening and stuff and how raised beds can be used that way. But like your vining crops, think about how much space they're going to take up. And, if you plant them in ground at the end of a garden, for them to run and have as much
Yeah.
space they want, because you don't want them to overtake that whole raised bed. And
Hmm.
That's like
just,
my cucumbers in this case.
well, cucumbers,
Depends on if they're the
yeah,
patio cucumbers or bush top, the really compact cucumbers. Yeah.
yeah.
So what would be other vining crops? Sorry.
So, like, if you decide to grow butternut squash, or if you try
Oh,
to do some watermelon,
Watermelons. Yeah.
or, something else like that. But,
I
like,
see. I gotcha.
yep, yeah. Those cucumbers, you could go either way. And especially sometimes, like, you can provide a small trellis for them to grow up. And that might be anchored better in a raised bed than out in your, just your general garden plot.
I've seen really cool raised beds at a community garden I was helping with, and they had them pretty tall raised beds, and they were about 3 or 4 foot apart, so you could walk in between them. And then they created like a
Like an archway, right?
yeah, an archway, and it was like a teepee shape, basically,
Mm.
where you could walk underneath it, connecting the beds, and they ran strings up so that they're beans. They specifically were doing runner beans, but you could also do melons or something like that and put some trellis up. Makes it easier to harvest. You don't have to bend over, and it also gets things, spreads things out a little bit more and utilizes some space. You can even use, if you create a trellis system, you can use that shade. We talked about shading out. If you overcrowd your plants, shading out is bad. But in some cases, you can use the shade from other plants for your cooler weather crops.
Mhm.
So, like lettuce is a good example of something that you could grow in the shade in the summer.
Mm. That's awesome. So I think I think what I've decided, I added radishes to my list because you said they grow really fast and I could use a easy win early in the season. I'm going to try to put my snow peas out now, basically now.
It's time.
Go ahead and
You can
seed
do it.
those. I'm going to wait and put the beet seeds out on around March 15th. Would you recommend that I do cucumbers as transplants or direct seeded?
I like to do mine if it's in native soil, direct seeded. But the cucumbers are one of those things you can do either way. But if you do transplant them, you got to be really gentle with them. If I'm going to grow cucumber transplants, get an early start on those, I actually use peat cups for those because then I can put the whole cup in the ground as a homeowner. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that commercially, but that way you don't have to try to force them out of their little growing container and risk damaging or even breaking the stalk off of cucumbers. Cucumbers, I prefer direct seeded. That's just a personal choice, but you can grow them as transplants and get an early start on those.
So I always grow mine as transplants,
Do you?
right? But
Well,
different
how do you grow those, Jessica?
different. Just in a regular like
Just gently.
cell tray, right?
Mhm.
And you get them up there where they have a couple of those first leaves,
True
those
leaves.
tree leaves on
Leaves,
there.
yeah. Gotta leave them.
But you're right; they're a little more fragile popping them out, but they'll
You
get a
learn to be careful with those when you work
nice
with
root
them, yeah.
ball.
I think
On
another.
them.
I'm breaking
But don't
character.
start them too early because that's the
Yeah,
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
they're
Like
very
you
fast
gotta
They're warm
transplant size.
season. They still need
yeah.
to go out at that May date, so,
Right. So
yeah.
they're something you can wait till much later and
Yeah.
then have a bigger plant to get out there and a earlier production off of them.
Yeah.
There's also some people who are super into planting tomatoes really deep, so that like those hairs and other kind of structures
Adventitious
can turn.
roots.
Yeah, the adventitious structure. I wasn't going to go
It's
terminology here,
it's
but
fun. It's a fun thing to know.
He's a new
it is.
gardener, Alexis.
I
Don't
mean,
don't
I mean,
confuse
what
him.
did you say?
Well, 'cause
Exmantitious, but
it's like, okay, these roots are adventurous. They're going where no root has gone before, right? And
when they have an advantage, they
they're
will
going up the plant, so
take it.
they're adventitious. I just think of
Yeah.
them as adventurous.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with cucumbers, that's not the case. Do not bury the stalk; it will rot,
Right.
and they will die. At least that's what I read on Reddit as I was doing this basic gardening
The
research
place of
earlier.
all knowledge. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Cool. So I'm going to do cucumbers direct seeded. I'm going to try that this year. Tomatoes, I'm going to do as transplants, but I'm going to buy my transplants.
Sounds good.
And then lettuce, we said I was going to direct seed.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's
And I'm going
it's
to
an
maybe
easy win.
do
We're
that
looking
as a
for those
tape,
easy wins.
seed tape. Is that what you called it?
Yeah. The seed tape.
Anything else that I'm missing as far as my first foray into gardening? I mean, I know that I did a lot of research and some work on soil prep and fertility and soil testing and all of that ahead of time. And if you're out there and you haven't done those things, you might think about should I go ahead and get a soil test if I didn't get one?
If you haven't
Yeah.
had one,
Yeah.
it's
It
time
doesn't
to get
hurt.
one.
Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't know
So
how long it would be or if it would
Normally,
be
we allow
able
a pretty
to.
good lead time for that. If you wait until, let's say, April in Kentucky, what that means is if you're working through your local extension office, you're going to have a pretty good lead time, sometimes upwards 3 to 4 weeks. It's not that we're dragging our feet. It's just we have very
There's a lot
busy
of people.
labs
it's a lot of people.
and
Yeah.
they serve a lot of people and they get really busy during the springtime of the year,
But
especially.
if I
So
didn't get one, I should go ahead and
go
get
ahead and
one,
do it
even if
now.
it is
Yeah.
late and
Yeah,
maybe
go
I
ahead and do
can't
it.
be
Absolutely.
optimal. That way
Yeah.
next year or in the fall, I'll be
Mhm.
ready.
The information's always good to have that. And for home gardeners, we say, I don't know, what do you guys say, every 3 years or so for a home gardener is a pretty good interval to retake your soil test, especially if you're modifying soil pH.
If it's a
Yeah.
raised bed, I usually say more often just because those nutrients leach and change so rapidly.
Profile is going to change in a raised bed every 3 to 4 weeks.
If it's in
Yeah.
grounds, I prefer every other year. But every 3
Every
years
year.
will probably be fine if you've not had any, crazy issues.
And
And
that's
when
as a horticulturist and soil head. That's sort of your every
Yeah.
2 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
And make sure as you are working with your local extension office, if you have a raised bed that has peat-based or potting soil in there, let them know that because it's a completely different type of test that they're going to do on that. It's not the same process as native soil. So
Mhm.
it's more of a greenhouse kind of test.
Yeah.
Solus medium, I guess. Solus media.
And two things I thought of that I always talk to people about when they first call and they're like, "Oh, hey, I'm going to start a new garden," which it seems like you've kind of already done your research on. Well, one, make sure that you're close to a water source, which I assume you are, because that is very important because nobody wants to haul buckets of water in 90-degree weather when they're like, I'm going to put my garden like far away from my house, right? Because it's most likely going to fail, not to be to be downer about it, but watering, pest, all
Yeah.
of that. But the other thing, and you've done your research about, is grow stuff that you actually like or are going to eat, right? So I am not going to grow beets
I'm not going to do
because
beets.
I am not going to eat them, right?
Yeah,
So
you can buy the juice for cheaper than growing it. So why
right.
would you? Yeah.
So why grow, like, even if some of these things look really pretty and cool, and just think about before you get started and overwhelmed with everything of like, what will my family actually eat? What will I actually use? And then maybe, the following year try something that you've never, had before and see, maybe I will like this, but not, do it. My other example I always give is, ghost pepper seeds, ghost pepper plants. Like one plant will give you like over 100 ghost peppers.
That's
So
plenty of
maybe
ghost
don't
peppers.
maybe
That's
don't
enough to
plant
haunt you.
Yes.
25
Very
of
nice,
those
Brett. Very
plants or
nice.
more.
Yeah, and you don't
Speaking from
need
experience.
yeah, you don't need 15 tomato plants if you're not going to can
There's only 2
tomatoes.
people that's going to be
Right.
eating
Um,
those fresh.
yeah.
Well, experienced person I was talking to recommended to me to pick like 5 to 8 things and just try those, and not because I had a list of like 25 things that I wanted to grow, and they all had different requirements and everything, and so I narrowed it down to a few just to see if I can grow those, and then I think I'm going to plan to expand from there. Does that
Yeah.
sound reasonable?
Start simple. It's
Yep.
what is a
Sounds
KISS
good.
method, kind of as you're starting out. Keep it simple. Yeah.
Keep it simple. What, Ray?
Keep it simple, silly. So,
Short
Oh,
stack.
yeah.
how could you tell I was silly?
Yeah, but that is a trick is and when I'm planting a garden in the winter and I have cabin fever, I'm ready to go as a new gardener. Um, And then when it gets to be 104 degrees in July, my enthusiasm level is at a whole. I'm a different person in July than I was in
Mm.
March and
Yeah.
April. So I'm a different person. Okay, I'm a different person. Having worked with a lot of community gardens, I see that that is a learning curve. If you're truly a new gardener, take into account the seasons, take into account your ability and your zone, and just be realistic as far as starting out. If in doubt, start a little smaller. We tend to overestimate our ability to manage things like water and
Mhm.
weeds and things and all the factors and care that go into a garden, especially if you have a shiny new, let's say, garden tiller that you just want to use and you go out there and plant your 10,000 square foot garden and then you realize, what have I done? I don't want you to
I'm
go through that regret. Yeah.
I'm gonna post on the Instagram. I found it. It's from a couple years ago, but I did a just like an infographic on. I called it containers for the couple. So if you just wanted to
Hmm.
grow in containers, this would translate to in ground as well. But for bush beans, peppers, lettuce, tomato, and zucchini, all of those can be grown in containers. So I tell you how many for what size container and how many of those plants per person.
Mm.
And so, an example is like you if you are the type of people who like to eat vegetables specifically, then you would maybe want one tomato plant per person, but you only need one zucchini plant for both people most of the time.
Yeah.
But I'll post that on there just in case
One zucchini
anybody
plant per city block.
per city block.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
neighbors, for your
Um,
neighbors, your neighborhood, whatever.
Well, now, Alexis, I want to find that content, but you said where am I gonna find it?
you're gonna find that on our Instagram at Hort
Instagram.
Culture Podcast.
Okay, I just followed you.
Done.
Yeah, so I'll post on there. I need to rework it a little bit, but
Cool. Well,
yeah,
I hope this episode was kind of like a fun,
Yeah.
different way of doing this. And if we hated it, that's fine. If we loved it, always
I
leave
like
them
the
wanting
topic
more.
because every year thing that keeps me interested in gardening and growing things is no 2 seasons are the same. You will have
Mhm.
failures. No matter how much you will have failures because you will never control all the factors that goes into growing a living thing. You just can't control that. And I guess that keeps me interested. Personally, it's the challenge. of having a good year and what goes into that. So
And I know we played up the bit of it, but the reality is you could go and have a conversation like this with your extension agent, talk to them about this kind of stuff, and
Get a
hopefully,
free ID 128 if you're the type of person who likes it like physically in your hands. I'm not
yeah.
judging you. I'm one of them.
It's a nice book, actually, not
Yep.
just
You
a
all still
print
sign
off.
those for people? Is that
oh yeah,
or is that just
absolutely,
me?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah. I
cool.
do it in big flory writing too.
I
Very
gotcha.
very
I feel
dominant.
less
Yeah,
special now, but
yeah,
that's good that
yeah.
everybody else gets to.
I tell yeah. That's
But yes,
top
you
letter.
if you're in Kentucky, you can go to your county extension office because you have one. They
All
all
120
120 of you
counties.
do. And you can go get that. Or again, you can find that online if you're the type of person who likes to be able to look at it on your phone wherever you're at and ask some questions. So ID 128 will put a link down in that in the show notes about that one. And we already talked about what you can find us on Instagram. You can leave us if you liked our bit. If you liked if you like Brett's bit, let us know and leave us a review, give us some stars, helps people find us. I know it feels weird. It always feels weird to me asking you all to do that because I feel like a little bit of a used car salesman or something.
It's the least
but
they could do for us, frankly, Alexis.
Own it, Brett.
You just carried a bit for 53 minutes.
He just stayed in character for 53 minutes.
Killing it. But yes, please leave us a review. It helps other people find us. And we've had some really great feedback from you guys. We really appreciate that. You can also find our email down there in the show notes if you all have questions, want to find something specifically, just want to tell us we're great. All of those are welcome. If you don't want to tell us we're great, we'll give you a different email address to contact and we'll go from there. But we appreciate you guys joining us today. We hope you'll join us next time. Have a great one.